just gone 7 o'clock. So I'd like to welcome everybody. And we've got people on from England, Ireland, Scotland, America, Israel, so all welcome. I'm Jodie, Sinyor. I'm head of campaign at UJIA. And I'm just going to give you a few housekeeping tips before we start. Firstly, I need to let everybody know that this event is being recorded. And I'm going to mute everybody except for the speakers while they're on. But if you've got any questions that you want to ask Alan or Dalia or me after the event, then if you can private message me and chat, then I'll pass on any messages that you've got. Also, if you're interested in UJIA's Social Impact Initiative, we've just done a brochure on all our new investments. So if you'd like a copy of that, just put your email in the private chat as well and I'll send it out to you. And I'm delighted to introduce now our new Chief Exec, Mandie Winston, who's just going to talk to you. And welcome everybody. Over to you, Mandie. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Dalia. Thanks, everybody involved. You need to unmute yourself.
Done. Erev Tov, good evening, and welcome everybody. I'm thrilled to welcome you all to tonight's UJIA event, Venture Capital with a Conscience with Alan Feld. My name is Mandie Winston. I am a British Israeli, and I am the Chief Exec of UJIA, and I moved from Mitzpe Ramon in Israel back to London in January, great timing, in order to serve this amazing organization as we enter our second century of connecting the British Jewish community with Israel. Now, I am as excited as all of you to hear Alan's insights. And one of the few unexpected upsides of the COVID-19 world is that we can more easily access people of Alan's caliber and wisdom as digital engagement changes the way that we conduct our business. And of course, the last few months have had unprecedented challenges, complications, and moments of unusual understandings about the way that the world works and what we take for granted. So alongside a deep appreciation that I have at the moment for health and for meaningful work, I realized how much I took for granted the freedom of travel between Israel and the UK, how much I took for granted Israel's economic success over the past decades, and how much British Jewish identity relies on a strong connection with Israel. So what is UJIA doing at this time to address these challenges? Like so many, we very quickly moved most of our content online with some advantages and disadvantages, and maybe Alan will speak a little bit about that later. In Israel, we continue to work hard to create educational and employment opportunities for Israelis in the social and geographical periphery, and this is needed now more than ever, knowing that our Zionist values will be fulfilled when everybody can participate in Israel's success. In the UK, we've been forced to cancel our young people's summer programs in Israel and camps as well. But our summer engagement fund will bring Israel and socially distant summer activities to young Jews across the UK. UJIA will continue to bring people together to find solutions to problems facing Israel and our UK Jewish community. And if there is an issue you think we need to address, then please talk to us to see how we can help you make change. My colleague Jodie, who opened this evening's event, is managing the chat function tonight and can answer any of your questions about how to help. And so tonight, we are creating an hour of connection between the UK, Israel, and global Jewry. We are honored to hear from the brilliant Alan Feld in conversation with my talented colleague, Dalia Black, who launched and leads UJIA's groundbreaking social impact investment work named SI3. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'm sure it will be fascinating, and thank you for being part of our UJIA community.
That brings me to introduce Alan and Dalia tonight. So good evening and welcome. You know, I have great pleasure in actually introducing these two fabulous guest speakers, Alan and Dalia, who will be obviously in conversation with each other. Alan is the founder and managing partner of Vintage Investment Partners, Israel's leading venture capital firm, and it's the only integrated venture platform combining secondary funds, direct co-investment funds and fund of funds. Vintage manages around $2 billion and tracks over 500 venture funds, 6,000 private technology companies, and it is also invested in many of the leading venture funds and has exposure to over 1,000 tech startups across Israel, Europe, and the US. Alan grew up in Toronto, where he read law and then completed an MBA. I think he practiced only briefly before entering the field of investment. And in 1994, he made Aliyah and is now a well-known philanthropist who is passionate about education and employment. He was founding chairman of Startup Jerusalem, an organization run by Israeli and Palestinian business people to foster job growth in Jerusalem. He believes that the workplace should be diverse with a common ethos of building something together, but I will leave him to talk more about this later. Alan is married with 5 children, 1 grandchild, and lives mostly in Jerusalem. Dalia is a founder of Weave Impact, an advisory firm that focuses on creating and implementing social impact investing strategies across Israel. Dalia guided the UJIA in setting up and managing the SR3, its impact investment portfolio in Israel. Dalia has over 20 years previous experience in the financial services sector, including as a VC of Dalia Group, which is the leading energy conglomerate in Israel. Dalia is originally from Manchester, but she now lives in Tel Aviv with her husband and 3 children. So it is over to you, Dalia.
Thank you, Glenda. And it is really exciting to see so many people have joined us this evening. We received all of your questions, and Alan and I will do our best to address all of them. So Alan, hi, good evening. How are you? Are you there with us, Alan?
I'm not. Don't know if I'm not unmuted, unfortunately.
You are now. I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Yeah. So no, things are great.
So rumor has it.
I'm here in our home in Caesarea. So what could be wrong?
So we hear that rumor has it you're actually about to announce closing a co-investment fund of over $170 million. You're also raising a 6th fund of funds. So sounds like the Israeli VC industry is not really feeling the current crisis. Is that right?
Well, we did announce actually yesterday that we had closed a new direct growth investment vehicle, and we will be shortly raising something. Yeah, you know, I would say it's been a mixed bag, out of fairness. On the one hand, growth capital is, for the most part, largely provided by US and European venture funds and public global tech companies. Today, about 85% roughly of the money that's invested in Israel directly into companies is by groups other than Israeli venture funds. So, you know, clearly the fact that people can't travel and visit here and do their due diligence here is having an impact. You know, and also there's a tendency when you hit a crisis like we're seeing now, that you start keeping the capital you've got in your existing funds reserved for follow-on investments into your current companies. So, you know, investors who hadn't invested in companies here are not yet investing because they're going to be reserving that capital to support their companies in their home market. So on the growth capital side, while we haven't seen any fabulous companies not be able to raise money, clearly there's going to be less capital chasing deals. So from an investor perspective, it's a wonderful situation. From a CEO perspective of a startup, it's not that simple. The other thing is, if you look on the more positive side, we don't have a lot of tech companies that are focused on online travel or hospitality or events, which are all, quite frankly, being, devastated by the current environment. We do have a lot of companies, though, that are actually benefiting from COVID-19 situation, and I think the recession that's clearly coming or is here. One is, we have a number of companies in the digital and remote health space. A lot of companies that are less sort of e-commerce companies, but providing infrastructure, software infrastructure for e-commerce companies. And of course, e-commerce is booming. We have technology, everybody is using Zoom today, but you can imagine now what that means for the telecom networks. The amount of video that is now going through the networks is enormous. So there are a lot of companies in Israel that have solutions to optimize communications networks, and they're doing well. We have a number of companies that are in the online entertainment area, specifically around games. And as people, are at home, they're playing more online games. Even a company like MyHeritage, which some of you may know, where you build your family tree, gather documents around your family history, et cetera. I mean, they're benefiting enormously from the fact that people are at home, are looking for something other than Netflix to do. So, so on the one hand, it's been a challenge. On the other hand, the companies that are focused on areas that actually benefit from COVID are doing well. One final thing is, as I mentioned, we're probably, if we aren't already, in recession mode. And when we look back on previous recessions, the companies that tend to do well are the companies that reduce the costs of managing a business. So anything that can optimize, or rather automate processes, optimize processes, take cost out of the system, usually do well in a recessionary environment. And so in Israel, there are clearly areas, that are based on artificial intelligence that allow you to automate business processes, and I think those are going to do very well in this environment.
So, just to touch on that, you mentioned remote health. We also know, for example, EdTech, education technology, has been having a boom recently. As a country that sees many exits in a year, and as a fund that's had over 50 exits, which is really quite phenomenal, do you think that there'll be an impact on the level of exits that we're going to see this year? I mean, I saw, an exit was mentioned in the press last week. Are we going to see a dip in that, a delay maybe by a year?
We're actually I mean, most people have thought that there would be a significant reduction in M&A. We've actually been very optimistic about M&A in the tech space. And there's first of all, the first 5 months of this year, approximately $4 billion of M&A took place in Israel. And and that's probably the best 5 months in Israel's history of acquisitions of venture-backed private companies. I'm not talking about acquisitions of public companies, but of private venture-backed companies. This has been an amazing 5 months. In fact, I mean, we've probably had the best 5 months of distributions we've ever had at Vintage. And we were fortunate to be investors in a company called Move It that Intel bought last month. But I think the driver for that M&A, and no matter sort of what happens, will be there's record amount of cash sitting on corporate balance sheets today. At the same time, I don't think there is a company that is not looking at itself and thinking, okay, what do I do to do a digital transformation of my business? Digital transformation has become even more urgent than it was before, because people's business models have so badly been impacted by COVID-19 and will continue to be impacted by the recession. So So while M&A is on, people thought M&A would be on the decline, we believe it's going to be the opposite, because companies have no choice but to reinvent their businesses. And so if you don't have that innovation in-house, you just simply have to buy it. So, what has surprised us, though, I have to say, quite frankly, is how many transactions started during COVID-19 and were completed during COVID-19. In other words, people were paying very significant amounts to buy Israeli companies without physically visiting the site. I mean, I find that, to do an M&A of $1 billion start to finish by Zoom, I never thought that would frankly happen, but it's happening. And I think it shows how desperate a lot of companies are to reinvent themselves, and how desperate they are for technology that allows them to do that. The other big surprise, I have to say, in light of what's going on, has been the U.S. IPO markets. I never thought that the markets would be back to where they are, and I never thought the U.S. IPO markets would open up. As much as they have. I mean, 3 companies, at least 3 companies have gone public at very substantial valuations in the U.S. We have several companies that now register to go public. So, while we were optimistic from day one that there would be a fair bit of M&A, we're very surprised about the IPO market, but certainly we're happy to be part of it.
So it's interesting, actually, I read an article that the Israeli startup nation has managed to pivot itself very quickly during COVID, which is what you mentioned, because of the stubborn attitude amongst Israelis and the ability to move fast and not give up. And I think that that's something that has enabled us to create the startup nation over the years. So would you say that Israel's tech sector has more or less suffered than other countries? Have you seen support for the government in a way that you've seen in other countries?
It's still early to tell, because we're only 3 months into this crisis, and there is still a fair bit of capital available here. The test will be, I think, as we get to Q4 this year, the beginning of next year. Certainly we'll see what happens if there's a second wave. But, clearly the fact that a lot of that foreign capital, foreign VC money, the foreign corporate money as investors in growth, and I'm not talking about acquisitions, just as investors in growth, has, declined, because growth investors do want to come over and see companies, and US VCs want to see companies. I think that will have some impact. Most of the Israeli companies, and I give the CEOs, our CEOs and everybody's CEOs, enormous credit. This is not a country, people here, whether it's primarily in the Army, from, relatively young age, face very significant challenges and have to react very quickly. And if you look at how quickly management teams reacted to the crisis, whether it was management teams lowering their own salaries, cutting staff to be more efficient, et cetera. A lot of companies, surprisingly, very quickly were able to preserve at least 12 months of cash. So, again, the test will be what happens next year, but at least in the short term, for most companies, certainly in software and some hardware companies, they're weathering the storm, at least initially. The companies that are facing the biggest challenges are the pre-revenue companies, and certain areas like life sciences. Life sciences, is very dependent on money from family. We have relatively few life sciences dedicated funds in Israel. So again, capital from large life sciences corporates is very important. There's a question mark to what extent that has been shut off or will continue or will be shut off. There are certain family offices, mostly from abroad, that have been invested in the life sciences space. So it could be a challenge for life sciences. As to the government reaction, Like the U.S. government in particular, but also the U.K. with the British Business Bank, the French government, BPI, and Germany have all reacted fairly well. These, until about a month ago, as many of you know, or 2 months ago, we didn't have an Israeli government. Since the elections, they hadn't been able to form something. So the Israeli government has been relatively late to doing much. And even since they've been since the government's been formed, they've been pretty slow to do anything of material effect. So at this point, the industry is largely on its own. And notwithstanding that, it's holding up, reasonably well. There is today about $4 billion of dry powder in the hands of Israeli venture funds. That will last for a certain period. Just to put it in perspective, last year there was about $8 billion invested in Israeli startups. So, that will at least solve part of the problem for a short period, relatively short to moderate period, but it's not going to be the long-term solution. And certainly, for the industry to continue to thrive, we will continue to need foreign direct or foreign indirect capital coming into Israel.
So to steer us to a more positive note, and the most popular question that we received is probably the question of the evening: what is going to be the next big thing? So looking to the next 2 years, what are the technologies that we should all be looking out for? Where do you think the next big ways exits are going to come from?
So, in the immediate, I would say that I would sort of split this into short term and longer term. So in the short term, there are, a few areas in which we think are going to benefit, very clearly. One of them, of course, is cybersecurity. As more people work from home or work remotely, the potential for breaches of security are just increased. So, anything certainly related to endpoint security or other things around facilitating work from home and ensuring the protection of the network is going to be extremely important. Again, looking at the possibility of second waves or third waves or whatever, or even another pandemic at some point, hospitals have to be, hospital beds have to be available. So I think the pressure on governments now to take patients out of hospitals, which even in the best of scenarios is a dangerous place considering what floats around in a hospital, is imperative. And so I think things like remote healthcare, remote monitoring of patients in a non-hospital setting is going to increasingly grow. And I think people looked at that as a long-term hypothesis. I think it's now become a shorter-term hypothesis because the necessity is there. I don't know the situation well enough in the UK, but there's certainly hospitals in the United States today, or even cities in the United States today, that all the hospital beds are being, largely being used by COVID patients. So, the need is there, and I think governments are waking up to it and will fund that, and will provide reimbursement for that in ways that they haven't done in the past. I think probably one of the most interesting things that's happened here, and the data in China particularly shows this, e-commerce penetration among people over the age of 50 was relatively low. Again, necessity is the mother of invention. A lot of people who never bought over the web, over the internet, are now buying over the internet. And the data out of China was that even when they reopened the economy, people continue to buy significantly over the internet. So we believe there's a clear pattern that's not going to change of increased usage of e-commerce. So anything that facilitates that, makes it better, makes the customer experience better, that provides customers with easy solutions to use e-commerce, clearly are going to benefit. Long term, we're strong believers in, and we've had this thesis for a long time. Doesn't make sense that all of us take an adult dosage of drugs. We're going to see much more personalized healthcare that will be largely technology based. Growing middle class rather around the world, growing population around the world, a shift to corporate farming in many areas, challenges around water, challenges around available land for agriculture. All that's going to create huge demand for agricultural technology. I don't know if that's going to be immediate because there's an absence of an economic or a financial ecosystem to support the companies once seeded. But I think, certainly over the next 5 to 10 years, that's going to be gigantic. I would even put ed tech, educational technology, in a longer horizon. And the reason is I have a great test in seeing how my own children have been reacting to online education. And I think frontal education through Zoom has been less than an enormous success. We're social beings, and that human interaction that the physical interaction is, and the sense of group work and the sense of we, has been affected by, shift to Zoom. So in the sense Zoom is more efficient, there are a lot of aspects of it that are missing. And I think people are going to have to figure out how we can make remote education culturally, psychologically effective. It's not a technology issue. I think it's, frankly, looking at education fundamentally differently, almost taking a whiteboard to education and not just simply taking education and putting it over Zoom, or education as we know it and putting it over Zoom. So I would look at ed tech as more of a longer term prospect.
So you touched on a host of topics which actually touch on impact technologies, but I know that's not the subject of our conversation, so I won't take you there. But it's definitely something that we're also passionate about: health tech, agricultural tech, education tech. So lots to watch out for. So you're doing deals all over the world, and you mentioned this before. How are you closing deals when you are not flying to due diligence? Can you give us some insights into your own business reality, how you're managed to do that on a day-to-day?
Yeah, a lot of, we've been fortunate that our investors have come back to us fund to funds. So, it's largely many of the same investors. We have some, we're mostly focused on institutional investors. That's the vast majority of our investor base is pension funds and endowments and foundations from the US, Canada, and we have a little bit from Europe, although we haven't made a big effort to raise capital in Europe. And so our investors have been ringing up from fund to fund. Starting with new investors is a challenge. And I understand it because quite honestly, when I go see a company, I love seeing companies. And walking into a company and just sort of seeing what the dynamic is in the firm, seeing if they're spending their money on furniture or on people, seeing how the founders relate to each other, how they relate to other employees is really crucial. I personally don't see how I can invest in something only based on a Zoom meeting. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but at least that's how I feel. And so, we have a number of investors who've invested with us and continue to invest with us, based on that. But at least our style is before we make a commitment to anything, we have to kick the tires almost literally on every opportunity. We take it extremely seriously that we manage other people's money. And at least in my view, I find it very difficult to do that effectively without physically seeing what's going on and physically meeting the people and seeing the dynamic for myself.
So it sounds like new funds are going to feel the situation much more than serial funds like Vintage that you're running. And as a fund manager who's got more than $2 billion as assets under management, I'm sure you've got your hands full, but yet you still managed to establish an NGO called Power and Diversity, an amazing NGO. What drove you to do that?
So actually, I'm a massive Jonathan Sachs fan. I'm sure many of the people on this call are as well, but he wrote a book that had a huge impact on me personally. It was a book called The Home We Built Together. And I think it came out in 2007. I think it was a few years after the attack on the underground in the UK. And it was very focused on the UK. It was about how the UK can succeed in building in a multicultural environment. How do you build a sense of we? And I thought the book, if you haven't read it, is a fascinating read, like almost everything else he writes. So, and basically he had a very interesting concept. He said, we've got to shift from a process of a social contract to a social covenant. And if you look at, traditional political thought, social contract, one had a social contract with the state. And when I think of the word contract, it's usually, what do I get? And the nice thing about the word social covenant, this is what he said in the book, was that it's two people working for, or groups of people working for a common goal. In other words, it's not a zero-sum game. It's the concept of covenant is there's a goal out there and we're going to work to build something together. And hence the name, The Home We Built Together. And when I applied that approach to Israel, and many of you I'm sure have been here, we live largely separately. And when I say the Israeli president, President Rivlin, is an amazing person, and actually has endorsed and helped sponsor this this program called Power and Diversity. He talked about the tribes here, the non-religious community, the ultra-Orthodox community, the Arab community, the how would I describe the Dati Leumi community, sort of the National Orthodox community, and the differences between them and how they've almost been going in different directions, and what the challenge that we face because of that. So when I look at how Israel's developing, that causes me concern, and part of that is because there's very little interaction throughout. So as I say, we study in different places. There's different streams of schools here that are largely either ethnic or geographic based. Second, not everybody serves in the army, which has been a melting pot in many respects. In university, you care about your own situation or your own marks. The only place where theoretically those four tribes can all come together for a common goal is the workforce, right? That hopefully everybody will be working for the benefit of the company, and the benefit of the company is their own benefit. So in a sense, the home we built together becomes the workplace. And so I'm one of those very naive and proudly naive people who believe if you put good people together in the same room, good things will happen. And we started with our own firm. We brought people from the Israeli Arab community, into our firm. We had people from the ultra-Orthodox community. We have a nice balance between men and women, et cetera. And the impact has been fantastic. It's not my enemy, it's my friend from work. And my hope is that or at least the dream behind Power and Diversity was, the Israeli technology sector is by far the leading economic sector in Israel. It's the most innovative. It's the one the country looks at. And if we can do something that has an effect of making the companies in this country more diverse, and therefore making the industry more diverse, I think it can have a very positive impact on Israeli society as a whole. Secondly, and frankly, diverse companies do better, produce better products. There's a lot of research. Harvard's come out with some studies. McKinsey's come out with some studies. We've even seen it anecdotally in our own companies. The more diverse the company, the better the product, because you're selling it to a diverse audience. One of the things here, probably many of you have heard of the unit 8200, which is a super advanced technology unit in the Army. Well, a lot of companies, it's just a bunch of 8200 graduates, and they're all geniuses, but they're like putting together software that only geniuses can use. If you have a diverse group of people working on this, not surprisingly, the user interface is better. It's the back end may be very complicated, but at least the front is much easier to use, much more simpler to use, and the companies succeed more. And so, we believe diversity is clearly, an advantage to those companies. So it's doing well by doing good. And the reactions have been very, very positive. We have, I think, about 35 Israeli venture funds on board. We have 140, I think, Israeli technology companies. Excuse me. And it's progressing very well.
I think it's amazing what you've achieved, and to be honest, in quite a relative small amount of time. And I'm sure that most of the people on the call, definitely, I share your vision.
You're giving me, by the way, way too much credit. I mean, also leading the Israeli Venture Fund, there's phenomenal groups here in this country. And thank you for the kind introduction, but, we're not alone in this industry. There's some phenomenal firms who are doing exceptionally well, funds managed by, fantastic people. As you know, we also have a fund of funds, and we're invested in some of those people, and they're great investors, and they're wonderful people. And I'm fortunate with the Power Diversity program. While I was the founder, we have a number of wonderful partners from the venture capital community who joined us in this effort, and are making, phenomenal inroads. So, thanks for the compliments, but it's really an industry effort, and I'm proud of the people in our industry that feel very much the same way we do.
So, in addition to the industry players who are putting a focus on diversity, we have businesses, for example, in UJIA's impact investment portfolio, which are providing accessibility for the Haredim, women, Bedouin, and Druze communities to integrate into, as you said, the lucrative high-tech sector. And it's an area that we've been very focused on as well from an impact investing perspective within the UJIA. So you mentioned already the diverse background within Vintage. Can you give us a little bit of insight? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you have around 35 employees at Vintage. What level of diversity do you have within your funds?
As I mentioned, we have people from various communities. So, and we hope we're going to continue to broaden it more than it is today. Let's put it this way: it was, you have a person from the LGBT community going to lunch with a person from the Arab community who's going, and a person from the Haredi community, and you're like saying to yourself, wait a minute, like, what is this? This is great. This is what it should be. And it's a nice feeling to say that, you feel like you're contributing to, to getting people together. And by the way, I don't think we compromised on quality of people. I mean, we had It wasn't intended to be a make work project. It was intended to be, we've got the message out that we want great people and we want the best, and the best come from various communities.
Yeah, that's great. And we look forward to following the path of the team at Vintage. Now, we want to move away from Vintage and over to you. And
I'm getting nervous already.
It's okay. Well, we've warmed you up slowly. So
I'm Canadian. We don't talk about it.
I think that, Alan, you have an incredible Aliyah success story, really. You came to Israel as a lawyer from Toronto, Canada, and you built yourself up to, with everything that you're saying, I know that you built yourself up to become one of Israel's most successful venture capitalists. We have quite a number of aspiring venture capitalists on the call with us this evening. So can you share a little bit about what drove you to this success? What was the passion behind getting to where you've got to?
So the passion was Israel. I moved here purely because of Zionism. My father passed away in 1973 when I was 11 years old, and my mother scrambled together the money to get us to come for the summer afterward in 1974. And we rented an apartment in Jerusalem. And from that second on, I basically fell in love with this country and always knew I wanted to move here. So it wasn't I moved because of venture capital. I got into venture capital only because I moved here. So it was, driven largely, as I say, by again, Zionism. When I first moved here, I worked on, as you mentioned, I practiced law in Canada as a securities lawyer, didn't want to practice law, and then just shifted from that to investment banking, and from there fell into venture capital. And I love venture capital because it's, every day I meet these young entrepreneurs who are amazing people who want to change the world. And it's like, I shouldn't be paid to do this. It's amazing stuff. It's super exciting. You meet these really, truly brilliant people, and it's been an amazing experience. So I'm fortunate, after sort of 26 years of being here and doing largely the same thing, loving every day what I do.
Amazing. I can relate to the Zionist drive.
Absolutely.
You just mentioned your mother, and the interview would not be complete if we did not mention your really quite amazing mother, Jodie Feld, who held an incredible secret. She basically masterminded the escape of 3/4 of the Jews from Syria over a period of over 20 years. It's really an incredible story, and I recommend everybody to look at the movie about Jodie. You were a child. Were you aware of the extent of her work at the time?
Yeah, somewhat, let's say. I don't know. I still to this day don't know exactly how she was buying people out of Syria, how she was helping to fund escapes. I know some of the story. I don't know all of it. All I know was, as a young kid, I learned how to cook because she was usually doing something at night in the room that we had no idea what exactly she was doing. And so, I organized demonstrations as a kid. It all started with my late father, who was a physician, and he had a patient who was a young woman who had escaped from Syria. The first time she tried to escape from Syria, she was caught by the Syrian authorities and was badly tortured. And when he asked her what had happened to her, and she told him the story, both my parents were card-carrying Ashkenazim, decided, hey, everybody's talking about Russian Jews. We got to do something about these 5,000 Jews in Syria. And so they started with demonstrations, other things, eventually family reunification. And over the course of the years after my father passed away, my mother, a young widow with 3 kids, started organizing this effort to basically buy Jews out of Syria.
Amazing. And I really recommend, I'll post in a minute the movie. I've just seen someone asking for more information. And I can just say, as the child to a mother whose family had to escape from Iran, I'm sure there are many families today around the world who are extremely grateful Jodie. So I have one final question, and I can see questions popping up on the chat. Alan, Israel is really known for cybersecurity, and you already mentioned that, and for numerous defense-related technologies due to the immense technological developments coming out of the IDF. Where do you see Israel's tech industry in the next 10 years? Is this what we're always going to be known for? Are we always going to be the leading startup nation because of security and defense, or can we expect to see something else?
So by far the largest technology budget in the country is that of the Army. Unfortunately, our universities in Israel have very small endowments. The government has not, in my view, has underfunded university level research. And so cybersecurity, not surprisingly, is some technology that comes out of the Army. A lot of the communications tech, a lot of the cloud related stuff is really coming out of the Army. So in a sense, the person who has probably the most influence on the future of Israel's startup nation is actually the chief of staff of the Army. I think there's an increasing realization, certainly among venture capitalists, but I'm hoping among government officials, that we can't keep our eggs in our relatively few eggs in one basket. We've got to start expanding. There's amazing stuff being done in universities in Israel, certainly in the food tech, the agri-tech spaces, even in next generation clean tech. I think it's going to be very important for this country. And those are, for the reasons I mentioned before. I think there's, it's not just because it's a nice thing to do. I think they're going to be huge areas. I think the food tech area, the way people's diets are fundamentally changing, the way, what I mentioned before about agricultural technologies and the growing need for it, I think there's going to be fantastic sectors. That is not stuff that comes out of the Army. And so, being able to fund that or funding that at the university level is going to be increasingly important. One other area that I think, I talked a little bit about the personalized medicine, but I think, another area, the whole concept of computational biology, like the Weizmann Institute, which has got that fantastic combination of outstanding biologists and outstanding computer scientists under the same roof. That mix of computers and health. We're just at the beginning of that revolution. And I think Israel could become, massively successful in that area. So I'm quite optimistic for the long term. And again, I'll continue to be a kid in a candy store I hope for the next 10 years.
Excellent. So the future looks bright.
I think so.
It's a positive place for us to end. I can see that we have a number of questions here in the chat, which I think we'll address perhaps via chat. And Alan, do you want to answer just one question?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the future fund that you've done in the UK is, we're actually investors in UK Venture as well. So, we've been following that closely, and a dear friend of mine, Saul Klein, has been involved in helping that get off the ground. I think it's a great program. You have the British Business Bank, which is the facilitator of a lot of that. We don't have an equivalent of that in Israel. And so it's been difficult for us to, get that capital as quickly as possible to startups in the same way. There isn't a vehicle to transfer equity capital from government-related sources to Israel, to startups. You have that with the British Business Bank. Congratulations. Somebody said, okay, Alan mentioned the issue of water, which is a global issue. Are there's really companies that are developing solutions with? Oh yeah, there's loads of companies in the water space. There's at least, off the top of my head, if I recall correctly, we have about 35 or 40 companies that are active in water-related technology. whether it's targeted at municipalities or it's targeted even for family farms. You know, there's some amazing things being done in the water space. Again, necessity is the mother of invention. We don't have a lot of water here. A huge portion of our drinking water is from desalination. And so not surprisingly, we're strong in that space.
Alan, there's one more question here. And since the Chinese are very likely listening to this call, I suggest you answer carefully. Are the Chinese active in Israeli business, VC business?
You know, they were much more active, I would say 3 years ago. There have been a lot of currency controls have been put in China and getting money out of China, period. And so that has caused some investors to be very wary of taking Chinese money, because every time you make a capital call, you're not certain if the money is going to actually make it to your bank account. We've also had a number of circumstances where Chinese companies have signed agreements to buy Israeli companies, and it didn't happen. So I think there's a certain wariness these days of you know, or people are much more careful working with China. Having said that, it's an enormous market. It's you know, the Chinese economy is hugely important and increasingly important. So it can't be ignored. But I think when people went in sort of, I would say, blindfolded to a certain extent, going in, now they're much more cautious. And hopefully we're all smarter about how better to deal with the Chinese market.
Alan, thank you so much. It's
my pleasure and my honor. I thank you very much for listening, and congratulations to UJIA, because I was fortunate enough to listen to what the organization does, and I know your efforts in Israel, and I heard about your efforts in the UK, and it sounds like an amazing organization. So I can only wish you continued success. And more than anything else, everybody, please be healthy and safe, and hopefully we'll all be able to get out of our homes earlier rather than later. So be well, everyone. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Alan. And,
we're just going to have a quick word from Johnny Morris.
Okay.
Johnny, can you unmute?
So I will unmute myself.
Sorry. Sorry to butt in. Johnny, are you there? I'm going to unmute you.
Thanks very much. Alan, Dalia, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's wonderful to be able to sit in the comfort of our own homes and be able to get a real sort of insight into what is happening in Israel, both in terms of the economy, technology, as well as what is going on in terms of diversity. And I think diversity is critically important at the moment, given events, you know, on, I guess, both sides of the Atlantic. So we really appreciate that. On behalf of everyone, and in particular UJIA, thank you very much for your time this evening. I know it's almost 10 o'clock in Israel. We really appreciate it. And we all hope that sooner or later we'll be able to come and visit Israel again. Sounds like it may happen after the 1st of August. And I think a lot of us are really keen to get out there. So make sure the weather stays warm for us. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And if you want a copy of our brochure, then just email me. Thanks a lot.